Good afternoon, everybody. ACNY would like to thank the New York City Department of City Planning for their cooperation in creating this seminar and providing two speakers. Frank Rochella Jr. is the Director for Zoning at the New York City Department of City Planning and has been with the agency since 2007. He has recently been overseeing the implementation of the administration's City of Yes zoning changes and previously led efforts to update the zoning resolution to promote goals such as affordable housing, coastal resiliency, and transit accessibility. Frank holds master's degrees in urban planning and architecture from Harvard's Graduate School of Design and a bachelor in urban studies from Rutgers University. Chris Hayner is the Deputy Director for Zoning at the New York City Department of City Planning. He has most recently been a core member of all the City of Yes text amendments, which have sought to promote carbon neutrality, economic opportunity, and housing opportunity to the 5 boroughs. He has been with the agency since 2008 and has worked on a myriad of citywide text and neighborhood plans. Chris holds master's degrees in real estate development and urban planning from NYU and Columbia, respectively, and a bachelor's degree in architecture from Syracuse. It is with great interest that we welcome them to speak with us today.
Hi, everybody. I'm Frank. I'm Frank, the zoning director. Chris is the deputy. I am what we wanted to go through, and we've done this a couple times in different places, is go into a bit of detail on what actually got approved in City of Yes for housing opportunity, and also where is it in the zoning resolution, right? Like, I mean, if you all have looked, you scroll through the online ZR, it feels really different. There's a lot of things that feel like they're. And one of the things that we want to do is make sure that we all sort of have a good sense of what's in the zoning and how it works. And also, honestly, answer as many questions as we can. We got some questions over the last couple days. We'll try to talk about those as we go through this. And I know we'll have some time for questions as we go through the presentation. Oh, okay. Thanks, Mark. Okay, so City of Yes, there were 3 City of Yes text amendments. So there's been a lot of change in the zoning resolution over the last essentially year and a half. What we're going to concentrate on today is City of Yes for housing opportunity. Next, maybe. Cool. And overall, if you've gone to a presentation about the project, if you heard things on the news, what we were trying to do was really scour the zoning resolution and identify all the ways that we could think about how zoning could be updated to make it easier to build housing, and to do that in as many ways across the city for as many building types as possible. So it wasn't just apartment buildings in like places like Manhattan. It wasn't just single-family homes in places like Staten Island. It was the whole spectrum. Next. That meant, and we actually had to print it out for the photo, there were 1,400 pages of zoning changes. It was by far the largest text amendment that we have ever done since essentially 1961, when the zoning we have was actually put in place. So lots of changes. What we're going to talk about for the most part was residential bulk. So you all are a great audience because I could probably just say 23. Article 2, Chapter 3 was where most of that was located. And one of the things that you'll see as we go through this presentation is we'll talk about what's in it, but we also really try on slides to talk about where it is. So, you know, after this presentation, a month or 2 from now, you can go in and see this and also be like, oh, I can go here to find that thing, right? So it's trying to not just be helpful today, but also in the long run. The other thing, we keep this in here just because there was that time period right after approval and in December and early January where we were still updating the online ZR. So a couple months later, The online ZR is now updated, so the zoning is now up there and fully. And so that is the zoning resolution at this point. Next. So the way we're going to go through this is I'm going to talk about low density R1 through R5 changes first. Chris is then, we'll do some questions about that. Chris will then come in, talk about medium and high density R6 through R12, talk about that, have some questions. I'll then come back to talk about parking and have some questions there. And then Chris will come in to talk about some of the more other citywide changes that really cut across all the residence districts, and so we thought it just made sense to group together. Next. So one other thing, sometimes we put this in the back. Let's see if it works. Oh, it did. Okay, cool. Sometimes we put this in the back. Sometimes we put this up in the front. And we thought it made sense here just as a thing to help as we go through this presentation. I don't know if you all felt this way, but residential bulk was probably like one of the more disorganized chapters in the zoning resolution. And a lot of that spoke to changes, dozens and dozens of changes made over time that really made it hard to like follow. Like if you ever tried to read it, things would just sort of jump in and out, and you'd really have no organization. So one of the things we tried to do as part of this, knowing that we were going to be making a lot of changes in that chapter, to try to reorganize the chapter and make it a little bit more coherent. And the key to that is essentially how one builds a building. So first you're going to start in 2310, which would be about lot size. How big does your lot have to be? 20 is then going to say how much floor area do you have? All your floor area rules will be there. 30, now we're going to start doing some site planning. So all your yards, courts, distance between buildings, open areas, all are going to be in 2330. Now we're going through dimensionally in 2340, so height and setback. Density, now we're going to start going in the building itself. We're going to have density regulations in 2350. Those times where the ZR talks about design, that'll be in 2360. And then those things that sort of like didn't fit anywhere else, we put in 2370. So people who think about height factor and height factor buildings, that 2370 is now where that's located. A couple other things. There used to be a lot of rules for inclusionary housing thrown in the middle of residential bulk, which really felt like very odd to like see all throughout the chapter. We moved all that out of residential bulk, so it shortened it a little bit. Moved that to its own chapter, administration, in 27, and also removed 28, which had been quality housing, because essentially all residential buildings moving forward get to be quality housing buildings. Cool. So we're going to talk about low density first. Low density in zoning world for us is R1 through R5 districts. And as a general matter, even though, in the rest of the world, when or at least in the US, when people would talk about like low density, they're typically thinking single family zoning, right? In New York City, our low density districts are much more varied than that. We have our single family districts, we have two family districts, which are much more prevalent than single family. And then we also have multifamily low density districts. And in all of that, I think the things that we've noticed are, even though you may be told you could build a two-family building, you could build in some districts multifamily housing, other rules in zoning often would jump on top of you and pretty much all make that impossible. And the best you could often get out of the zoning typically would be like a single-family home, and that may be parking, it may be bulk, it may be all sorts of weird bulk rules. And so one of the things that we wanted to try to do is address those things and get them out of the way so that the zoning actually allows you to build the building types it says you can do. And also just, even though it just says it, that's also just true on our neighborhoods too. So, right, like while we do have single family neighborhoods, we often have neighborhoods of single, two-family, and multifamily buildings more dispersed. And we wanted to make sure that the zoning actually allowed that too. Next. So one of the bigger areas of changes was what we would be calling, if you had seen public presentations we had done, were called district fixes. And the idea of this was trying to address all of the issues that I think we have seen over time about yards, FAR, the envelope, yard regulations, that made it, A, hard to build buildings, but then also often oddly made it hard to build buildings like their neighbors. You'd have situations where like your neighbor was like 5 feet from the front lot line, you were told you had to be 15 feet from the front lot line. And just sort of weird things like that that we wanted to try to address to actually give people some more flexibility. Next. So a couple, if I have the, it's okay. If and when I get this clicker, I'll be able to point at stuff. So I'll try to do it this way. 2 areas where that was probably most impactful. Number one was minimum lot sizes. So maybe before CHO, it always felt like every low density district had its own slightly different minimum lot size. And that was strange because when you actually looked at the lot sizes that happened to exist on the ground in those districts, they actually were much more, they all tended to be like 25 feet wide or 30 feet wide. And so one of the things that we tried to do is actually lower the number of minimum lot sizes and group more of them into minimum lot widths and lot sizes that better reflected what actually was in the districts today. So most of them are 25 or at most 30 feet. There's a couple outliers for R1s R1's about it, but everything else really falls into the 25s and 30s. The other change, and probably the one that's like more impactful, often when we'd look at new construction next to older buildings, the FAR of the older buildings would usually be bigger. And so one of the things that we tried to do was get the FARs in each of the districts increased a little bit in each district to better reflect what was built in those districts. So usually, typically like R1s through R3s, max FAR was like 0.5 or maybe went to 0.6 if you had attic bonus. What we tried to do is make this instead 0.75. And that better aligned with what actually was built in areas. That was going to be true then in like the R4s. Typically that had been like 0.75. Now it's 1.1 FAR, and the R5s go to 1.5 FAR. So this is just available. This is like starting point, trying to give people the ability to build. And generally what we think this does is it lets you build a 2-family house, usually then more easily than you could a single-family house. You could do multifamily that looks like multifamily in the districts. So these numbers, they do increase, but we think this actually helps build what the zoning says you could do. Next. So these are like 1,000 little changes. I'll just generally talk about where some of these are. They're really all in 23 and really found throughout the chapter because they're really hitting all of the big rules in zoning. So the lot widths, the lot areas are going to be in 2311. Floor area in the 20s is going to be 2321. All of the changes to yards, generally trying to allow you to align with neighbors in the front, make the side yards less wide or make them narrower than previously required. And in rear yards, give people who are doing detached houses or on wide lots, other forms of housing, give them the ability to do a 20-foot rear yard. Changes to coverage reflect those changes to yards. Height and setback, some tweaks, mainly just trying to simplify some of the building envelope things. You often had pitched roof envelopes. Some started at 21 feet, some started at 25 feet. Just trying to bring some consistency to that, but also make it easier if you're doing multifamily housing and you're allowed to do it, to give you a flat roof envelope. If you were often like in an R32 or R4, you could do it, but you had to do it in a pitched roof form, which is sort of weird. So we tried to simplify all that. Single and 2-family houses no longer have density factor. You just have the permitted use, which is single or 2-family house. And change some of the front yard planting to bring consistency with the R6 through R10 rules. Next. Other way? Cool. So if that is just trying to get the districts to do what they said they could do, the next couple things were areas where we were trying to let the zoning do more, or let people do more than what the zoning previously had done. And in zoning, that was really two things. One, qualifying residential sites. I'll talk about that here. And then in a little bit, we'll talk about accessory dwelling units, is what we typically call them, but ancillary dwelling units in the zoning. Qualifying residential sites was trying to reflect the fact that, like, when you looked at neighborhoods in the city, even when the zoning said you could only do, say, for example, a single-family house or a two-family house, you often saw situations in those neighborhoods where there were small, older apartment buildings that just were in the neighborhood. And what we tried to do through City of Yes was to give some more opportunities for that. And based on where we were seeing those older apartment buildings, try to reflect that in the zoning. So qualifying residential sites is the very elegant name we came up for that in the zoning. And really has two forms. So in residence districts, just pure res districts, you can be a qualifying residential site if you are within the greater transit zone. That's going to be the areas closest to transit in the city. If you're on a lot that's at least 5,000 square feet, and if you're located on a wide street, so 75 and over, or a short end of the block. If you're any of those, you get to be qualifying residential site. I'll talk about what you get to be in a second. Second, and maybe less typical, but more broadly available, is if you have existing community facility uses, any zoning district, so R1 through R5, if you get to be a qualifying residential site if you're in the greater transit zone, near transit, and beyond it, you get to do it if you're on a lot that's 5,000 square feet or greater. So it's a lot of flexibility in these things, but for the most part, it's that first tranche that's probably the most applicable. Go to the next slide. So what do you get? What happens when you're a qualifying residential site? So two sort of main things. One, envelope-wise. Your envelope is increased in size. So generally, in the R1s, the R3s, you get 35 feet. The R4s, you get 45. And the R5, you get 55. But you also get a higher FAR than a typical standard residence. Usually 0.25 to 0.5 more, just in line with each of the districts. So the chart on the right with floor area, you have your standard FARs, and then the qualifying, which are a bit higher. The other thing, just sort of obviously worth saying, you also get to do multifamily housing. And so if you're in a single family or in a two-family district, you also get, as a qualifying site, the ability to do all residence types. Thanks, actually. Where are some of this in the zoning? First, a lot of this and the applicability is going to be in defined terms. Just because they cut through in so many chapters, we felt like we had to do it here. So qualifying residential site in section 1210, the defined terms, that's where you're going to find the applicability, those things about locations near transit, wide street, things like that. Your floor area is in 20, and back now you're in 23. Your floor area is going to be in 2321 again. Side yards, just a little different just for these buildings in 2330. And height and setback, that chart I showed, in 2340. Next. There's this, should we try? Oh, okay. There's also a little bit of a different version for C districts. So this is like commercial overlays and like a C41 in low density districts. To try to reflect that, like, there often were already multifamily housing in commercial overlays, typically with ground floor commercial on the bottom. We tried to make qualifying residential sites more broadly available in these places. So next. You get to be a qualifying residential site in any commercial overlay. There are some limits for buildings that in some overlays when you're like adjacent to like single family houses, or if you don't have overlays around you, But for the most part, this is the sort of easier path if you're in a commercial district to be a qualifying residential site. And so all of that is in the applicability in 1210, higher floor area, same height and setback. Importantly, if you're near transit and you're in a C overlay and you're a qualifying residential site, even if you are like in an R3 district or an R2 or R4, the zoning in commercial bulk for residences, 34, tells you to be R5. That's a big change. That essentially that can increase your FAR by like an additional 1 for residences. But the idea is it better matches what tended to be in those areas more than the zoning map itself. And then subtle but important, if you're doing a mixed building, so you're doing like ground floor commercial, in mixed building in commercial, so 35, you get the ability, you essentially get a half FAR free space for non-res uses. So it essentially tries to like make sure that housing and commercial use are not competing with each other at grade. Next. Oh, it's working. Yeah. Okay. Can people hear that? Okay. Next is ancillary dwelling units. So typically if you ever see in other cities or even in like the press when we were talking about City of Yes, they'd be called accessory dwelling units. We call them ancillary just to steer clear of accessory use in the ZR and just make sure that there was never any confusion about how this building type and accessory worked together. But the general idea, and something we'll talk about later, and the other half of this is zoning is one piece of the puzzle for ancillary dwelling units. There's a lot of other law, and a lot of other building code, for example, changes that need to occur. But the zoning really was the first piece, right? Because if you don't have the zoning to do it, it's sort of unnecessary to think about some of those other things. So what the zoning now says is for any single or two-family house, you are allowed one ADU for that single or two-family house. It's limited, you have a size limit, 800 square feet for that ADU. There are some size, or I guess you'd call it location restrictions from where it locates on lot lines or from different buildings, usually 5 feet from lot lines, 10 from a different building. Size control, if it's out in the backyard, typically 1 story, or if there's parking below, it can be 2 stories, 25 feet. There's some rules we'll talk about later about non-compliances, what may make it easier to use existing buildings to do this. But this is the general starting point of, from a bulk perspective, what one has to do for an ADU. A couple other rules on the ADU. At the initial occupancy, there has to be a homeowner living on the lot. Additionally, there are a number of rules that limit types of ADUs in different parts of the city. I guess I'll just say this way. Typically when people think about ADUs in like the rest of this country, it's a backyard unit, it's a granny flat, it replaces the garage or it is in the garage. In New York City, our lot sizes are a lot smaller. We often don't have backyard parking spaces. And so the zoning tries to think about a wider variety of ADU types, whether that be in an attic, a basement, in a backyard, or even just somehow in the primary structure itself. But there are some restrictions in some areas for some ADUs. First, in the coastal risk districts, which are like a couple places in Staten Island, along the coast of Staten Island, Brooklyn, and Queens, there are no ADUs. Typically, you can only do like a single-family house at best. That continues there. There are restrictions on subgrade ADUs in the coastal floodplain and also in the inland floodplain, which is the first time in zoning to address this. And there are some restrictions on backyard, I'll call them backyard ADUs. Same thing about coastal flooding and inland flooding. Some zoning districts, when they're far from transit, historic districts, and portions of very niche in zoning, the Special Bay Ridge District. Next. Most of this, again, going to be in the definitions in 1210. So ancillary dwelling unit has a lot of this applicability. Backyard ancillary has some more particular rules for that type. If you look at like the use regulations, so single family, and the defined terms for like single family and two family residence, they also now mention ADU as part of the allowance for that use type. Permitted obstructions talk about the like where a backyard ADU can locate, and some of the rules about the distance between buildings are, actually I should flip those, are in 2330 for distance. Next. So that's low density. What do you think? Should we go to questions about low? Yeah, I think that's fair.
Would you mind going back to that slide where you have the 4 types of ADUs shown?
I would love to.
So when you say basement, do you mean cellar?
In zoning, I mean, I think it's more basement, but
So if you have a cellar, you can't put an ADU in the cellar? Like you can't have 50% below ground?
let me say it this way. In zoning world, the zoning doesn't focus on it, but I think there are other rules that get at that, in like building code, right?
So
Is there a lineup provision for new buildings with a shallower front yard to adjacent buildings?
If you want to, so in front yard, typically you have like the minimum dimension, right?
Sure.
And then the zoning says, if you want to go more forward than that, you have to have somebody adjacent to you that's more forward than that.
Okay,
But I don't think it says you have to line up to them.
okay. So if there's,
Yeah, it's an allowance.
so for example, like R3X, if it's 10-foot front yard,
And what's the person next to you?
yeah, and say that the person next to us is 15 or 20. Is there
You
any?
don't have to go further back.
Okay, but you can't, there's nothing saying that you can't line up. You have to line up.
There's nothing saying that you have to line up.
Okay,
It's only a rule that says if you want to go forward,
got
you
it.
can if someone is more forward of that line.
Okay. In Staten Island, all my questions are going to be for Staten Island specifically. Oh, sure, of course.
Well,
You had a chart up there for the floor area, permitted floor areas, that was 23, 21. You see that?
that's fair.
Yeah, that's it. That statement, there's
Yeah.
an asterisk that, under the standard zoning lots, there's a number 1 on the .75, and it refers to the statement below the chart.
Yep.
Can you better explain that?
It says that, so the city council, when they reviewing the project, they added the little footnote that says essentially no single unit can be, if you're on a lot that's 4,000 or more, no single unit can be more than 0.6 FAR. So if you are using, typically the FAR had been 0.5, maybe with attic bonus, if you had it, it was 0.6. So it kept them whole to that number, but allowed you to do, if you're allowed a two-family house, you could always go to 0.75 if you're doing the two-family house, or if you're doing the ADU, you can do it there also.
So basically, what you're saying is that, say in an R2,
Yep,
if you got a 50 by 100,
yep.
previously you were allowed .5, which
Yep.
is 2,500 square feet. Now you cannot use the .75?
You
can
can-
only be
you're always
0.6,
allowed the 0.6.
3,000 square feet?
You're in an R2? Is that what you?
Yeah, I'm referring
So you're
to-
always allowed up to you could do 0.6 as a single-family house.
Okay.
In an R2, because you're typically,
One
it's only
family
one family.
Detached.
That additional 0.15 could be the ADU.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Hi, that was my question.
Okay.
No, but to follow up, it's a little bit penalizing, like if you have a 38 by 100 lot, you can do .75, but once you're at 40 by 100, you're down, you get kicked down to 0.6.
Yes.
And the follow-up to that is, at 23-242, there's special provision for certain communities, like
Yeah,
below
in
average
South in
age.
Brooklyn. Yeah,
They kick that up, FAR increases to 1.0.
yeah.
Does that override both 0.75 and 0.6?
That should. Yeah,
Okay, thank you.
yeah.
Before I get to the next question, there's a new, when you go to Zoller and you click on the zone, there's a new table that comes up, and it's listed on the streetscape. It says, front yard has to be at least as deep as adjacent front yard, but not to exceed 20 foot in depth. That was,
What district? Sorry,
that's all right. So when you go to, if you go to Zoller and you click on the zoning description, there's a table that comes
oh, I
up now.
think I think that's just, okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to,
Yeah, yeah.
because that's the only place I saw it, I wanted to make sure that it's off. the
Yeah,
table.
I will say, and we'll talk about maybe some of this later.
Yeah,
Text got approved in December. We spent the first month trying to get this zoning text up.
sure.
We've then spent the next few months trying to make sure people have seen errors, people have seen issues. We've been doing presentations like this.
Yeah.
We have to get back to the website and actually clean the website.
That's all right, yeah, that's the first time I actually
Nope,
saw that table, so okay. Unqualified lots, in Staten Island specifically, what is the exact definition of the greater transit zone? Because some places I've seen 0.5, a half a mile to the first step of the train station, and then other parts I've seen, like, there's a map of,
So I'll talk about you know
Okay.
what? Let me just, because
okay,
maybe I'll say it this way. It affects parking a lot. It also affects other things.
Yeah.
I'll talk about the geography in the parking section to just
Great.
answer some of that.
okay.
I have a question about the ADUs in the flood zones.
Yep.
So in the zoning and the definition, it talks about these 2050 and 2080 prediction maps, specifically from DEP.
Yep.
Where exactly can we find those maps and how to look for that?
DEP, by council legislation, has to produce those maps within, I'm forgetting the actual date that they have to do it by. They have to produce those maps like within the next like month or so.
Oh, okay, so they're not.
They
available.
don't exist right now.
Okay.
Yeah.
And, okay, so.
I mean,
guess-
there's a slide in there that generally shows what they look like, but like the formal official maps, DEP had to like, the council made DEP do it, so they're doing that right now.
Okay, so I guess when they come out, they'll be through the DEP website?
Yeah.
Okay, all right.
Hi. Would a rear yard ADU be not permitted in a historic district, even if it were, say, an existing structure that LPC approved an adaptation of?
So it was like the garage or
Like the
something
garage,
like that.
yeah.
I guess it's a non-compliance issue. You're not doing anything to it. You're just sort
Well,
of,
I imagine minor changes that landmarks might say is appropriate.
can we look at, I think this is a question we should like look at, just play through the text and just be able to get back to you. Yeah. It's a good question.
I have a follow-up question for the ADUs in the, have a follow-up question to the ADUs in
Okay.
the flood zone.
Okay.
So basically, if the ADU is permitted based on 2050 prediction map and would not be permitted based on 2080 map, would the ADU be still allowed to be built for those 30 years and by maybe filing some restricted declaration?
I think the text, I'd have to look at the specific wording of it, but I think it just says if it's in one of them, it's out. So I think, I assume if it is in 2080, it would not be available to do a subgrade ADU.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you for your presentation, first of all. The rear yard ADU, you said that you needed a 10-foot setback from any other building. My question is, if the neighboring property has a non-conforming structure in their rear yard, do you need to maintain the 10 feet?
I should have been clearer. It's on the lot. It's on the lot itself.
So you could build to the lot line?
So
potentially?
there's a rule that, there are two rules for it. One is 5 feet from a lot line, so your
okay.
lot lines. And then that structure from the primary structure, I'll just call it that, that's the 10-foot dimension. But if there's someone across on, the lot next door or something like that, the zoning doesn't try to make you look at that.
But so the 5 feet on all three sides, is that what you're saying? You need to stay away from the property line by 5 feet and all, so it starts
That's right.
to cut away at it. Okay,
Yeah.
cool, thank you.
You had mentioned, and it's in there too, that community facility uses outside of the transit zone, 5,000 square foot or better, and it previously had community facility uses. Does that mean that if that lot fits that description, you're able to demolish it and then build to the new? What happens to that community facility?
Yeah, this is a great question. So we're still talking with DOB to make sure we know how they're reading that provision. So I'll say it this way. What originally DCP, City Planning, proposed is not what came out of the process.
Okay.
City Council made some edits to it, put a provision about the use had to exist and things like that. So we're trying to make sure, let's put that one in the list to confirm, that we'll get back to you on, because I want to
Okay.
make sure DOB is,
Cool.
we know what DOB reads it as.
Yeah, what was the intention to allow housing on a site like that, or?
The intention was that if you had a community facility when approved, it's like if you have a community facility, you should have access to this thing. What DCP proposed was you have community facility on the lot at the time of, as you're building your building.
Sure.
So that has to be now is, you're 10 years into the future, you can't just add a community facility after 2025, 2024, and say I'm a qualifying residential site. It had to have been there on the date of enactment.
Right. So say there's a doctor's office on a lot, and it's a 7,000 square foot lot, it's
Yeah.
outside of the transit zone. The main question is are we able to take that doctor's office down?
Take down the whole thing.
Yeah.
That's what we want to confirm with DOB. It's a
Okay.
great question. I think there's the intent that the council had in their changes. There are some scenarios that I think have been raised that we just want to make sure we understand what DOB was saying. It's also, Mark, on your list, this question, so it's one that it's a similar one.
All right, I'll talk about medium and high density now. So this is moving into R6 through R12. My district fixes that I'm going to talk about are a little bit different than Frank's. We've done a lot of work in R6 and above districts over time. I would say these are a lot more targeted, a lot more, focusing on niche issues. I've broken them into 3 different categories that I'll talk about. The first category is, district fixes that support better unit design and configuration. The next category is district fixes that are removing antiquated or exclusionary rules. And then the third category are some tweaks that we made to the bulk regulation to better reflect specific contexts. After I talk about district fixes, then I'll move into a discussion of changes that we made for UAP and MIH, which were the UAP ones in particular are much more core to the project. The first group of district fixes are changes to support better unit layout. I was mentioning that we've done a lot of work in the agency looking at heightened setback regulations, FAR, a whole range of different bulk regulations for medium and high density districts. Over time, we've focused a lot on how building height relates to existing buildings, and I think we've done a fairly good job, and we've refined the rules over time. But one thing that we haven't really looked at is how new buildings relate to the footprints of existing buildings in a lot of neighborhoods. And what we realized is that, a lot of our rules were kind of conspiring to force you into pushing your units into pushing you into scenarios where all you could do was a bar building. There were no really great opportunities to bring light and air into bathrooms, into kitchens. or even have double exposures and more light into bedrooms and living rooms in the way that a lot of our pre-war buildings had. So we tried to investigate, well, why is that? What is it, a zoning issue? Are we actually inadvertently, producing this scenario? And we found that to some degree, yes, we were. We had a role in it. And that because you had a sort of strident 30-foot rear yard, 30-foot minimum court depths, maximum lot coverages of 70%, and a range of other rules, there was no real possibility to actually have a court that pulled back and actually have the room on your lot to be able to do some of these things. So that was one of the first issues that we wanted. It's probably the largest issue that we grappled with in terms of district fixes for medium and high density districts, was this minimum dimension. So we started with the rear yard, and we changed the 30-foot down to 20-foot, up to a height of 75 feet. So now you can start to mimic the pre-war buildings if you want to. You don't have to, but it's an allowance, and now folks can have the opportunity to pull the building back a little bit and actually put the courts back into buildings and hopefully get double exposures again in our bedrooms, and maybe a little more light and air into our kitchens and bathrooms. Because we did that change to rear yards, we also did it to our court dimensions. We did it to minimum distance between windows and lot lines. And then we mirrored it as well. So rear yard equivalents are now, instead of 60, they're 40 feet up to 75 feet. And we also changed the maximum lot coverages to also work in tandem with that. Thank you. In terms of where these are located, this is a scenario where if you recall the way that 2300 used to work, all of these rules were scattered all over the chapter. Lot coverage was in 2310, rear yards was in 2340, 2350, distance between buildings was in the 2370s, and then courts were in the 2380s. We've tried to really consolidate all these rules, and now they work kind of sequentially. So you go from your rear yards to courts to coverage to distance between buildings, and then distance between windows and lot lines. So they're kind of one after the other. You'll find them right in succession, and all of them, work to really govern your footprint. So it makes sense that they all would be in sequence. Next. Okay, the other change to support better unit configuration, this is sort of looking more internally. Frank touched on this a little bit, and these are changes to density. He mentioned that, in the low density districts, we changed and consolidated all of the dwelling unit factor rules to be 680, which is a big change for low density districts. In the medium and high density districts, in a lot of the city, it maintained at 680. It had been 680. It still is 680 in a lot of the city. But the new thing to look out for is in the core parts of the city, and the Manhattan core community districts 1 through 8, as well as the downtown Brooklyn special district, there is no dwelling unit factor for new developments or enlargements. So you can have a new building that is exclusively studio apartments and not have to worry about a dwelling unit factor anymore. The other change is that we got the council to approve a liberalization for conversions for dwelling unit factor. So if you are changing from a non-residential building to a residential building in the same geographies, Manhattan core, downtown Brooklyn, if you're going from any non-residential to residential, there's no dwelling unit factor for the converted residences. And then outside of that geography, if you're going from community facility to residences, you don't have a dwelling unit factor. So that's something to watch out for. Next. More targeted in where these are located, they're in the density section, they're in 2350. Next. Okay, the next group is changes that we made to remove antiquated or exclusionary rules. Sort of the poster child for this that we think of is sliver law. This is a rule that started out as a good rule. It started out as something well-intended, and then over time it became more and more obsolete, unneeded, and it even got to the point where it was starting to tilt into a little bit of being exclusionary. The reason for that is it was created in the 1980s. It was created before contextual districts were a thing. It was created before the quality housing program. It was created when the only game in town was sky exposure plane buildings. And they were trying to regulate building heights in places where small, narrow buildings were popping out against the context. And it was trying to put a height limit in a place where otherwise they wouldn't have one. So it was well intended. It applied to zoning lots that had a width less than 45 feet. But over time, a lot of those areas where it originally applied were rezoned. They were rezoned to contextual districts. They had height limits imposed upon them. And sometimes the sliver law mandated a height that was lower than those districts. And so you oftentimes couldn't even get your fully permitted maximum residential FAR in those locations. So it kind of was stymieing residential growth over time. So we wanted to remove sliver law in places that already had a height limit applying to them. If you're going to use the standard district regulations that have height limits to them, you shouldn't be subject to sliver law. Whenever we saw rules like this, whether they were sort of a rule that was well-intended and became a little bit exclusionary, or a rule that was just plainly exclusionary, we sought to remove that. Next slide. So just some examples of things that we removed. There were artificially suppressed residential FARs in R6, R7, and R8 districts on wide streets in Manhattan core. They were lower than what you would find elsewhere in the city, so we removed those. There were special FARs in certain community districts in Manhattan. We removed those. There were special heights that were lower than you would find elsewhere. We removed those. I talked about removing sliver when you're using standard height and setback rules. We removed that. And then we did the same when we encountered these same sorts of things in special districts. A couple things that we kept. The city council put back the height limits in limited height districts, but they did allow, if you're building affordable housing, you can exceed the limited height district heights. And then if you're going to continue to use the path of building a sky exposure plane, which are still allowed, then you will be subject to sliver law. So that's going to be located in 2370 along with all the other regulations for sky exposure planes. Next. Okay, the third category of district fixes are changes to better reflect certain contexts. I've broken this into two different parts. The first part I'll talk about street wall rules a little bit, and then the second part will be just more general height and setback regulations. In terms of street wall, just a few tweaks that we made. We tend to think of our street wall rules as kind of being of two different types. There are lineup rules where your location of street wall is sort of determined by your neighbors. A standard rule in this would be that you can't locate closer to nor further from your neighbor. And it's intended to apply to your typical brownstone streets of Manhattan. It emerged from those areas. The problem with those rules is that over time they were imposed on non-contextual districts, and they were extended into the outer boroughs. And sometimes you had situations where you were on a narrow street, you're building a new development, you're in a lineup rule, and your neighbor is a single-family home that just hasn't been redeveloped yet. So you're being told to line up to a neighbor that may not be there in 5 years. And that was a little bit of a quirky scenario. So what we did was we limited the applicability of the lineup rules. We ratcheted them down really to only the R6B, R7B, R8B districts. If you're a non-contextual district, we've brought you into the other category, which is the percentage-based rules. Percentage-based rules are a pretty simple rule. A standard example of them is that 70% of the street wall should be located within 8 feet of the street. So just a very simple rule. Many buildings in these areas followed those rules to begin with, so it made a lot of sense to just move them into that category and simplify it a lot. The other thing that we did for street walls is that we tried to create looser street wall rules on pretty predictable scenarios that we knew were coming up, and they just didn't really warrant a strong onerous street wall rule. So some examples of that are large zoning lots. Say you're a half of a block, over 40,000 square feet. You're starting to establish your own context at that point. We ratcheted down the street wall rules for that scenario. Another example is if you're next to an elevated rail line, you're a transportation infrastructure adjacent frontage. You probably don't want a strong street wall, especially if it's a residential street wall right next to the rail line. So we've turned those rules off if you're next to a rail line. The other thing that we did is that we've said in historic districts, we want to give you more flexibility to match your base height with a neighbor. So whether your neighbor is taller than the maximum base height or lower than the minimum base height, you can now match your neighbor either way. Next. And then in terms of some more general height and setback rules, in non-contextual districts, we created a new term called eligible sites. And here we did a couple of things. First, we created different criteria. And if you met this criteria, you were eligible for additional height in your envelope. The criteria is kind of three-pronged. I'll talk about two of them on this slide and then the third on another slide. The first two are irregular sites. So if you're a shallow site, or irregular depth site, if you have strange topography, if you have a weird angle, These are situations where previously you might have turned to height factor to just give you a little bit more flexibility, even if you didn't necessarily want to be penalized with the FAR of height factor. We saw many examples of folks that just kind of needed that flexibility because the quality housing envelope was just a little too stringent. We wanted to bring these people into a sort of more normalized universe and just bake in the flexibility for them. We knew that was happening on irregular sites. We also knew that was happening on transportation infrastructure adjacent sites. So against elevated rail lines or against highways, people just wanted to be able to pull their building back and just have a little bit more flexibility. So if you met either of those criteria, and the criteria is stipulated in the section, all very specific, lot depths that would unlock it, or lot angles, or topography. Any one of these, or all of these, unlock that extra height. So that's something that we created for non-contextual districts under eligible site rules. In contextual districts, we did a minor version of that. We said if you're in a contextual district and you're fronting on an infrastructure adjacent frontage, you can lower your maximum base height so that you don't have apartments right next to the rail line. You can lower it, and then you also get an additional 1 or 2 stories. So it's a smaller version of eligible site, but it is a little bit more flexibility. And a lot of our special districts kind of already were using that concept, like Jerome Avenue in the Bronx. A couple other things, not to the degree of these other two. Tower rules. These are something that many places have the original tower rules from 1961. Over time, as our big sites have become much less common, folks have kind of bumped up against them, and some of our special districts have liberalized our tower regulations just to give more tower coverage, just to contend with smaller and smaller sites. So we loosened those up in the underlying text and made the maximum tower coverage up to 65%, up to a height of 300 feet, and then 50% above that. So it should help just bring a little more flexibility to some constrained sites. And then we also adjusted the transition rule that you would face within 25 feet of a district boundary. Next. This is just an example of the eligible site heights. So it's its own section. It has its own table, and you'll see that these maximum heights are anywhere from 3 to 4, 5 to 6, 7, 8 stories above what you would ordinarily have for the district. So it's meant to be much more generous, much more flexible, and bring people in over from the height factor world into just a standard height limited world. Next. The third tranche of eligible site is for large sites. And this is something that we were trying to grapple with from the onset, is that we really wanted to make infill possible on sites with existing buildings. This is something that the quality housing program was pretty bad at. It was something that it was sort of incompatible from the get-go, that you couldn't have a site with existing buildings that poked out over the quality housing heights and do infill on them. It was not allowed. You sort of, if you were in that height factor world, you had to stay in height factor world. And we recognized from the very beginning that was really impeding a lot of potential on our sites with existing buildings. Some of them being campus sites, but some of them also being medium sites that just happen to have 1 or 2 existing buildings on them. So we knew we wanted to address that from the get-go and create a pathway for them going forward. So they became the third prong of eligible sites, and it unlocks for large sites if you're over 20,000 square feet. Now these are a little bit different from the other 2 tranches in that in exchange for the additional heights on these large sites, there's a lower maximum lot coverage. That lower lot coverage is 65% on sites that are 30,000 square feet or more, and then 50% on the largest sites. And what that is there for is it's really to protect the largest campus sites from just completely paving over all the open space traditionally associated with that campus. It's still a pretty generous lot coverage, but it is trying to maintain some vestige of the older existing open space. In a similar vein, the City Council added a rule that no infill is permitted over recreational amenities that are existing on a campus site unless they're replaced in kind. So just really kind of preserving those amenities for those campus sites. The other thing that is eligible, that is in place for these eligible sites that are on large lots, is there is a penthouse rule. If there's an existing building on a site that's over 40,000 square feet, and that existing building height exceeds the heights in the table that I just showed on the previous slide, then the new building can match it, provided that it doesn't exceed 25% over the height of the table. So that's just an additional rule. Next. Okay, so these have a lot of different sections. They're hitting a little bit in lot coverage, a little bit in rear yard equivalents, just in maintaining flexibilities they had. True all regulations are going to be in 23431. Eligible sites is also in the height and setback section, 23434. This is after sort of standard height and setback regulations. Tower regulations follow eligible sites, 23435. There are additional height and setback provisions. That's where you'll find the base height matching rules in historic districts. That's where a lot of, of the sort of range of miscellaneous height and setback provisions are located. There are special tower provisions. These are the old tower and base rules. They're located in 23441. They modify the underlying or, have a little bit of supersedence over the underlying tower regulations. And then there are special provisions for geographically specific areas. This is where you'll find a couple different things. You'll find the contextual district rules for transportation infrastructure adjacent frontages that give the 1 or 2 extra stories. And you'll also find the transition heights here. So they're in 23443. Next. Okay, that was the district fixes. Now I'm going to move on to UAP, Universal Affordability Preference. So UAP was one of our flagship proposal components, and we were really excited about it because it kind of changes the traditional narrative of how housing growth occurred in the city. We had been so reliant on our rezonings to get additional residential capacity, so much so that we were really concentrating growth in different neighborhoods. And we really wanted to kind of change that paradigm and allow housing to grow over the entire city so that more neighborhoods were doing their fair share of growth. So UAP was a core fixture of that. And what it was trying to do was just increase the residential capacity if you're providing affordable housing. And once the text was adopted, it was in place and people can hit the ground running with it. They don't need a rezoning or anything else. These rules are immediately applicable. So now affordable housing can occur in any residence district across the city that's R6 and above. Next. In terms of the bulk changes that facilitate this, the first is obviously the FAR mods. Generally, it's about 20% more than the standard residential FAR. There's a couple instances where it's more than 20%, and that's just because there was a pre-existing allowance for senior housing FAR that was more than 20%, and it just wanted to match that pre-existing FAR. It's generally in R6 and R7 districts. Unlike some programs in the past, unlike our voluntary inclusionary housing program, for example, there's no suppression of your non-affordable FAR. You just have your standard residential FAR, and then you have an additional FAR for qualifying affordable housing. You don't have to use the full amount of it. You can use, a little bit of it, you can use half of it, or you can use all of it. But it's just a second FAR that sits above the standard FAR. Because we're giving additional FAR for this, we also continue to give additional height for this. It's generally about 1 or 2 extra stories, and it's meant to fit that extra FAR. UAP is replacing the old voluntary program, so it's replacing the Inclusionary Housing Designated Areas program, and it's replacing the R10 program. There are special vesting rules in those geographies, and this is separate and distinct from MIH. MIH has its own areas. If you're in an MIH area, you're not eligible for UAP, and vice versa. That's it on this slide. Next. A couple minor things to the mandatory inclusionary housing program. One of the things that the city proposed is we wanted to have MIH option 3 be a standalone option. So this is previously you'd only been eligible to use option 3 in conjunction with option 1 or option 2. Now it is a standalone option, so a rezoning can just apply for option 3 alone. We also equalized MIH FARs with the UAP FARs. So there were some instances where pre-existing MIH FARs weren't quite 20% over the standard district FAR. We didn't want 3 or 4 different FARs for essentially, similar functional things in the zoning. So we tried to equalize them across the board, equalize the heights just to make your lives and our lives a lot easier. So there are some instances where the MIH FARs increased slightly. An example is R6A went from 3.6 to 3.9 to equalize with the UAP FAR that was equalizing with the AIRS FAR. So just kind of consolidation across the board. We also did a little bit of streamlining in the ZR for 100% affordable projects, just to reduce conflicts with term sheets and subsidy programs and facilitate more affordable home ownership programs. Next. Do you want to go back just a little bit? Just one slide. There you go. Just to give you a lay of the land where these are located, the FARs are in 2322. We tried to make this a little bit simpler. There is just two columns of FARs. There is your FAR for standard residences, and there's a separate column for qualifying affordable or qualifying senior housing. So just two separate columns to look at. Height and setback is similar. There is a minimum base height that applies no matter what type of housing you're doing. Then there's a maximum base height for standard residences. There's a maximum overall height for standard residences. And then there's maximum base and overall heights for qualifying affordable, qualifying senior. So all one table, just you can kind of look at them side by side. If you're using height factor, if you're using a sky exposure plane building, you're still in 23732. And if you're in R6 through R9 district, there's no pathway to use UAP with that. There has never been sort of a compatibility between our affordable housing programs and height factor, and it stayed that way. Hopefully there's plenty of flexibility in the underlying rules now, so that if UAP is something you want to consider, that there's a pathway for you to just use the standard regulations. Frank's going to talk a little bit about the special rules for parking rates for qualifying affordable senior housing. They're located in 2520. And then we moved all the administrative rules out of the bulk chapter and into Article 2, Chapter 7. There's their own section now, so you don't have to kind of weed through the FAR tables to find the affordability rates that are required when you do MIH, or what will be the affordability rates for UAP as well. So they're all in a separate chapter, and hopefully that's a lot easier to kind of navigate through the FAR sections. Just a other note, there are a couple other places to be on the watch for. Obviously, there were a lot of pre-existing bulk regulations throughout the ZR, and we wanted to make them compatible with UAP. We didn't want to send everyone to the underlying rules because they already had very bespoke FARs, very bespoke envelopes. So instead we tried to engineer some of those bespoke envelopes and bespoke FARs to work with UAP. An example of that's the waterfront bulk. We brought UAP into waterfront chapter, and we re-engineered the envelopes to kind of be UAP compatible instead of just trying to do something separate. So we kind of overhauled them completely. And then many special districts also had special FARs, special bespoke envelopes. We tried to engineer those FARs and engineer those envelopes to also be UAP compatible. So that's another thing to be on the lookout for. Next. This is just showing the new FAR sections and the new height sections. You see that there's two columns in the FAR section, one for standard residences, one for qualifying affordable, qualifying senior housing, and same thing in the height section. Just you have your columns associated with standard residences, and then the columns associated with qualifying affordable housing, qualifying senior housing. Hopefully it's a lot simpler, all in one table. You can just kind of compare your options and assess what's best for you. Next. Questions on this section?
My question is about how this interacts with other pieces, specifically special districts. You mentioned base height matching with historic districts. There's also FAR that UAP allows that certain districts don't allow. Is it always the special district that governs, even when it goes against what the CHO would have wanted to provide, like 9.02 for R9 that gets watered down to 7.5 in West Chelsea Highline, or Tribeca base height rules that wouldn't allow the minimum base height, et cetera?
Yep, that's a great question. And that took a lot of our time kind of thinking through all those implications, because we tried to do this balancing act where we want to bring the good things of UAP into as many areas of the city as possible, but also want to preserve sort of the core planning principles of the special district. And West Chelsea, Tribeca are great examples of this, where there were certainly a lot of balancing act to do, because they're certainly doing laudable things. And we wanted to maintain those, but also make sure that UAP was possible in that area. So we generally tried to work with the FARs that existed there. If there's a maximum FAR that existed for IHDA, then that became oftentimes the UAP FAR. And we tried to reverse engineer a standard FAR, below that. If it had no inclusionary structure associated with it, we took the maximum residential FAR and multiplied by 1.2 to create a UAP that was specific to that special district. And we did the same thing with height and setback regulations. If it had a special base height, oftentimes we would respect that, but we did want to make sure that the overall envelope could accommodate the FAR associated with it, with UAP. So that's sort of our standard approach in a nutshell. I don't know of a special district that we didn't touch that was R6 and above to facilitate UAP in some way, if it didn't already connect to the underlying. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I need to drill down
Yeah,
specifics, but that's
yeah.
not here. But
Okay,
thank you.
yeah, of course.
My questions are specific to NYCHA housing. In probably October or November, there were some provisions that were very specific to NYCHA that were stripped out. And so I'm wondering, is NYCHA treated differently, or, if it's an R6, it's an R6? And then specifically, the definition of qualifying affordable housing, is that meant to include NYCHA housing or not?
The first part, the change that was made kind of before the city council changes, that was made, yes, it was sort of a political decision, and it takes out the applicability of the eligible sites to NYCHA. If they want to use the standard heights and the standard FARs, that's still available to them, as is their typical process of overrides. And it's unfortunate, but it still will be available to them. In terms of your second question, the definition of affordable housing and how that works, do you know that offhand, or is that something we should? Yeah, we'll have to. So Frank and I are not the ones that wrote the intricate 2,700 rules. We wrote almost all the other rules, but not that one. That was a lot of HPD and collaboration with them.
Small, but I think I would also say, it depends on what is being proposed and whether it meets the standards that are listed for UAP. It's probably the best answer.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, hi, Chris. Thanks so much for doing this. I have a question which I think I got an answer to, on December 6th, when it was fresh off it wasn't even printed yet, but I want to make sure I'm still understanding it, that I still get it right. With respect to qualifying affordable housing, which will give you certain height increases or other bulk allowances to fit that, I want to confirm, if you can, whether there's a minimum amount of qualifying affordable housing if it's required to be on-site, and if it's a UAP off-site option area. Did I get that right?
Yes.
If it's one of those, then is there a minimum amount of certificates that they would have to purchase in order to get that qualifying height? Height. Has that been settled yet? Is that?
I don't know the latter. Your first question on, is there a minimum amount of qualifying affordable housing you need to unlock the FAR or unlock the heights? Not in the zoning. There are none in the zoning.
So then that goes back to what HPD is willing to process,
Yeah,
right? Okay.
Absolutely. Sorry.
Yeah, if I can. This question is actually on street wall location.
Yep.
And there is a definition on prevailing street wall location. Can you just expand on that? Because I have a corner condition in an R6 that one of the lot is way beyond almost 40 feet setback. But there's this condition that I wasn't sure about.
Yeah, sure. So this is something that we created as part of this to address scenarios where you might have oddball blocks that just don't really match what the district intended. An example of this is you might have a block where you're an R6B district, you have really rigid, street wall lineup rules. They say you can't be closer to nor further from your neighbor. And that works on, 90% of the blocks, but then you get to this block and it doesn't make any sense. They're all over the place, and it's not the prevailing street wall condition is not based on this. Sort of the inverse of that, if you had a 70%, percentage-based rule, and the baseline rule says 70% of the street walls have to be within 8 feet of the street line, and lo and behold, your block just happens to be the aberration from that, where everyone is set back 15 feet. We don't want to force you into a scenario where you actually are defying the context by following the zoning rules. That doesn't make a ton of sense. So we created this out that if the majority of your block, if your majority of your social block deviates from the baseline rules, then you can sort of match them. That's the spirit of the rule. I'd have to look at it more specifically to see what your options are.
And that falls within the 2 feet average between that front wall, right?
Yeah, that's right. You're sort of assessing your neighbors, and you're kind of creating your own datum. And if your datum is different than the underlying rules, then you can use these alternative sets of rules.
Gotcha. Thank you very much.
Yep.
Trying to get closer to the microphone. So my question is more general and is about whether or not you took into consideration in the changes to the height and setback and bulk regulations in these medium-high density districts, trying to make it more possible to build modular housing, which by its nature requires more height in order to accomplish the same FAR than standard construction. So did any of the rules about height and setback get relaxed in order, but even with the same FAR?
Not as part of this project. In one of our previous projects, zoning for quality and affordability, we were looking at modular housing and sort of modular, standard floor-to-floor heights. And we did revise our sort of baseline zoning assumptions to accommodate a sort of 10-foot floor-to-floor assumption just to make sure that if someone wanted to do modular, there was room in the zoning envelope to accommodate that. So we think we mostly addressed that in our 6 and above districts as part of our last project. And so hopefully that's functioning well, but you can tell us if that's not functioning well, or if those assumptions have changed and maybe there's another housing amendment in the future.
I think there should be if we want to encourage modular housing, because so far I don't think that it actually is producing much housing that's built using a modular method, and I think that's because the restrictions are still a little too tight. And you're always constrained by your goal is to build the most FAR possible. That's what you paid for your site for. So in my experience, we're not building modular housing because it doesn't help. We are not able to maximize our FAR on these like R6, R7, R8, those kinds of sites. And I think that would hopefully unlock a lot of development in, areas of Brooklyn, Queens, these lower mid-density districts.
Okay.
But I'll be happy to be on your committee if you form one. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, hi. I was just wondering, are there maps showing where R11 and R12 are going to be now?
The Manhattan office is currently proposing the Midtown South Special District. That will have R11, R12. That's the only thing that we have so far in terms of proposals for those districts. They're on the books, though, and they're eligible for private applicants to come to us and propose rezoning. But in terms of the city, we only have the one so far.
Okay. So now that we've done R1 through R5 and R6 through R12, we're going to try this again? Okay. We're going to talk about parking across the board for all residence districts next. So, that's great. Thank you, Mark. If you were following the project during public review, the city proposed to remove all parking requirements moving forward for all housing everywhere. That is not what came out of the process, but it still represents a big change to the parking requirements in the city. The best way to think about it is there are some geographies kind of coming out from the Manhattan core that where parking essentially rises the further out you get. Before CHO, before anything, you didn't have a parking requirement in the Manhattan core or LIC. Those were not changed by CHO, those continue to exist. The next area that was created in CHO is called the inner transit zone. So generally, this is the part of Manhattan, Brooklyn, and Queens that rings the Manhattan core. In those areas, there no longer is a parking requirement for housing. Beyond that, in the outer transit zone, when you get you're still close to transit, but beyond that inner transit zone, the parking requirements are fairly reduced compared to what had previously existed. And we'll show some examples in a sec, but the idea is those requirements are fairly reduced from what had previously been there. And then the area in zoning called beyond the greater transit zone, most parking requirements stayed the same, but there's some subtle differences generally there to bring consistency amongst all the different zoning districts that can be useful depending on the situation. In addition to those geographies, there's some special rules that exist for some forms of housing, generally the forms of housing focused on in the project. So in what I call on the slide zone 2 and 3, so that's the outer transit zone and beyond the greater transit zone, even if you're in those areas that generally for housing would have a parking requirement, there is no requirement if you're doing an ADU or if you're doing a conversion. So that makes it easier to do those two forms of housing. Next, if you're in those areas and you're doing one of those qualifying residential sites, you are waived out of parking as long as you're doing up to 75 units of housing. So that's a fairly large apartment building and gives qualifying residential sites more flexibility for site planning, costs, things like that, up to 75 units. In the outer transit zone, there's no parking for affordable housing. There's a fairly low requirement in the areas beyond the greater transit zone. And just for sort of complicated reasons of public review, there are some geographies in Queens and the Bronx that follow the requirements of the outer transit zone for affordable housing, but the beyond the transit zone requirements for standard residences, just for lots of complicated reasons, but generally, again, lowers their requirements at least for affordable, or at least for some forms of housing. So let me give some examples in a sec. Next slide. Two other things, maybe three other things, I guess, just on the before getting into the specifics of numbers. Previously required parking. So generally, if your parking requirements change or disappear, you would be able to just remove the parking. That is only true if you are a single or two-family house in the inner transit zone. If you no longer have a parking requirement, if you built that building, if you had parking associated with that building that was needed before, you could remove it. All other parking, required parking removal has to come to the City Planning Commission and maybe also to the City Council, depending on where it is in the city. But the idea is, so if you have a previously requirement, you still have to keep that parking. A little bit to make things easier, particularly in areas where we removed requirements for, let's say, a new construction, all parking in that inner transit zone can be turned into public parking. Typically in multifamily districts, you could lease or rent spaces for periods between a week and a month previous to CHO. Now you could rent it for any time period. That was true in the Manhattan core, and this aligned it with that area, which also didn't have a requirement. Everywhere else in the city, including in the lowest density districts, you can now rent all spaces for between a week and a month. And the other thing, a little small, but maybe helpful just on the practitioner side, the zoning went a little crazy when it came to floor area exemptions in low-density districts for parking. There were different districts that had different allowances in different places, and it was hard to explain. It was hard to rationalize as why the zoning got this detailed, and all of that we tried to make simpler, a lot more consistent, and give everyone essentially the same floor area deduction for parking spaces. Next. So now let's look at numbers. So one of the other things that, at least those of you all have probably experienced this too, when you'd have one chart in the zoning that would tell you your parking requirement, would give you a percentage, and to be like, okay, that is my requirement. And then later on, if you kept scrolling down, you'd find all these things that would say things like, oh, you actually have an exemption if you're this lot size, or actually if you're this form of housing, your parking numbers are reduced. And to try to simplify that, we tried to liken some of these other things, but all of this in a single chart so that everybody could know what their parking requirements were and if you waived out of parking. So these are charts actually just taken from the online ZR for the outer transit zone on the left and the area in the beyond the greater transit zone to the right. The example we often give, just to give a sense of the scale of change, is an R6 district. Say it was quality housing before, 50% requirement, 5-space waiver. So you could do like a 10-unit building and get out of parking. In the outer transit zone, if you can see the R6, the requirement in column A is now 25%. So that's cut in half. And that's fairly consistent across all the districts. Affordable housing, qualifying affordable housing, qualifying senior housing, ancillary dwelling units, all zero. So there's no requirement for that form of housing, those forms of housing. And then on the right is the waiver. So 5-space waiver back in before CHO R6. Now 15 spaces. So in general, that means a 60-unit building would be exempt from parking. You're still allowed to provide it, but you're not required to. Beyond the greater transit zone, generally the same chart. Things are a little more complicated because different forms of housing have different parking requirements, but you can still follow through the same way. R6, 50%, so it's similar to what it previously had as a requirement for standard residences. And the waiver, in this instance, we're actually able to get it a little higher, up to 10-space waiver. So you can do a 20-unit building in an R6 beyond the greater transit zone and get out of parking. There are a number of footnotes here, all trying to either reflect things that had previously existed or things that the council was looking to put in place. But the general idea is outer transit zone, pretty good drop of the requirements, beyond generally the same, except for some smaller instances. Next. The locations where you'll find this information, like what is in these geographies, are in those defined terms: the greater transit zone, inner transit zone, outer transit zone. One of the things that we will be honest and admit to you is those definitions are complicated. They require you to look in 2 or 3 different places. It is hard. It has been hard for us to do some of that work. One of the things that we've done since approval is put a layer on Zola that describes those different geographies to the best of our abilities. We've worked with the MTA to identify where their stations are. We mapped all of the areas based on the rules that are in the zoning. And so Zola is our best stand-in for what the zoning itself says. for those different geographies. Floor area, that thing about the lower, the sort of more consistent exemption, particularly low density, that's going to be same thing in 1210. Inner transit zone is going to be in 2521, outer 22, beyond the greater transit zone in 23, and all those rules about rental periods for spaces, that's going to be later in 25 and 2541. Next. Non-residential parking, so most of the project was about residential parking, but there were a couple of small changes for non-res spaces. So houses of worship, basically R6 and above, didn't have a parking requirement, had it for lower density. Houses of worship no longer have a parking requirement anywhere in the city. Second, if you're doing a mixed development, so if you're in a commercial district and you have non-res space and you have residential above, there are waivers for the parking requirements for the non-res space, dependent on where within those different geographies you are and your lot size. There were some things like this in Staten Island previously and some special districts. This just brought that rule consistently out into the entire city. Next. So that parking's quick. If there are questions on it, if not, we can do it with the rest.
The floor area exemption in lower density for a private garage?
Yeah.
The text says 300 square feet
Per
for
zoning
zoning lot. What if you have multiple one-family?
So one thing I will say is, so this is an example where if you look at the earlier text that it existed before CHO, that wasn't the way it was written.
Right.
We wrote it and nobody noticed it during the entirety of public review. Totally unintentional. Like that is not what we meant to, we did not mean to like harm people's ability to do a larger development and lose their exemptions. Problem for existing buildings and new buildings. We're trying to look at trying to clean that up.
So is that likely to get some sort of a clarification?
We would like to, yeah. We're
per single family.
I think it had previously been per building,
Right.
And I think that's the same.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so specifically in the inner transit zone for existing buildings, it says that parking must be retained pursuant to this table.
Yep.
And then for qualifying affordable housing, the table says 0. So you said earlier that parking could not be removed absent a discretionary action, but that seems to indicate that at least in that situation it can.
Sorry, I should have said, well, in those instances, that parking would be not required parking. It would then at that instance be permitted parking. So that, I think, we've got a couple of people have asked us this, and I think the requirements in there dropping to 0, like depending on when the building was built and the type of housing, that was already generally true. It may have just been permitted parking at the time, depending on the scale and depending on things. But that is possible. Like if you are able to meet the qualifying, you said affordable, disqualifying affordable housing definition, you would then, your parking requirement would be 0, which it could have been when you built it too.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
Okay. Last but not least, other. So this is just a kind of a collection of miscellaneous items that we couldn't easily slot into the other sections, but hopefully there's some interesting stuff for you all here. The first change that we want to bring to your attention is an expansion of the old quality housing program rules. So quality housing was not only just the FAR and the heightened setback regulations, it also had program elements in the quality housing program in old Article 2, Chapter 8. And what it was doing was oftentimes giving floor area exemptions for doing good things in buildings, like providing recreation space, or there was a couple of different floor area exemptions for good corridors. If you were providing daylight in corridors, or if you had a limited amount of density on the corridor, or if you provided trash rooms, you got to exempt space on every single floor. What we wanted to do was kind of two different things. One, we wanted to bring these rules into the 21st century and broaden the range of amenities that you could get exemptions for. And then two, we wanted to expand the applicability of it to all multifamily buildings in all districts. So it's kind of a drastic change, but hopefully it's for the better. So now all multifamily buildings are eligible to deduct up to 5% of the gross floor of the building for amenities. It doesn't have to be specifically recreation space. It could be recreation space, but it could be other things like packaged storage, or a library, or a cooking space, or something else that is in modern buildings. And we kind of left it a little bit open because that could change in another 5 years. It could change in another 10 years. The things that we're looking at buildings now, I don't think we would have ever imagined 20 years ago. So we kind of tried to learn from that and try to make it a little bit more evergreen. And then again, it applies in all multifamily buildings going forward. So that's kind of a big change. And it pairs nicely with some of the changes that Frank was talking about in lower density districts, the qualifying residential buildings and things like that. Next. The second thing I want to mention is changes to the conversion regulations. So we've had longstanding regulations in Article 1, Chapter 5 that allow you to convert non-residential buildings into residences. And you get a bunch of different zoning liberalizations with that, and also some changes to building code and access to special provisions in the multiple dwelling law. What we did in this amendment was we expanded the applicability of these rules from sort of the darker purple area to the entire city. So now non-residential buildings throughout the city are eligible to it. And we also changed the date. So previously, the non-residential buildings had to exist before 1961 in most of the city. We changed the date to 1991. So now, anywhere in the city, if you have a non-residential building constructed before 1991, you can convert that through Article 1, Chapter 5. Next. The next change is to the Transfer Development Rights Program for landmarks. This is also a sort of process and applicability change. Previously, it had been a special permit from the City Planning Commission, and if you were a landmark, you could transfer unused development rights to zoning lots that are adjacent to you, across the street from you, or catty-corner from the intersection from you. The first change is a process change, so we've facilitated this through a chair certification. So this is a ministerial action done with the chair of the City Planning Commission. It does not have to go through a lengthy public review. It's just a ministerial change. So you come to the department, and it's mostly an accounting exercise. You're just kind of tabulating the amount of development rights available, and you're deducting what's the existing building is using, and then you're transferring them. So that's the process change. The applicability change is that now you are eligible to transfer those through this chair cert to any zoning lot on the same block as landmark, or to a zoning lot that's across the street from that block, not lot, block, or catty corner from the intersection from that block. So it's a much broader geography. Next. Thank you. The next change is to split lots. The way that split lot regulations work typically is that prior to CHO, is that you would create an adjusted floor area ratio. You'd basically take the portion of the zoning lot in the high density district and the portion of the zoning lot in the low density district, and you would come up with an adjusted FAR. And the FAR in each portion couldn't exceed whatever the adjusted FAR was, or the district FAR, whichever was higher. In effect, that meant that you were typically smushing, if you wanted to shift your FAR internal to the zoning lot, you had to shift it downwards. You had to kind of smush it downwards. There were limited allowances to shift it upwards. What we did in CHO was we expanded that. We said anyone can shift upwards if you're shifting to the wide street. So now everyone has that allowance, and it kind of makes a lot of planning sense, because oftentimes the wide street will be where the higher density district is. You have a corner lot that could accommodate more FAR, and it helps you kind of preserve the lower density character of the mid block. So we think it makes a lot of sense, and now it's the citywide rule. Next. Another process change for railroad right-of-ways. We previously, anyone that was developing on a zoning lot with a railroad right-of-way was subject to a special permit from the City Planning Commission. We tried to create some instances where it was simpler procedurally if you had a zoning lot with an abandoned right-of-way, or you were a small lot with an existing railroad right-of-way. For those subset of conditions, we've tried to make the process simpler. Some of it involves a chair cert in place of the special permit. Next. We mentioned just a little bit before, but we've created new zoning districts through CHO. We've created some new high-density districts that exceed the typical 12 FAR range that had been in the zoning resolution from the very beginning. We have R11 that goes to 12, and we have R12 that goes to 15. These are both MIH districts. Sorry, I said that wrong. R11 goes to 15, and R12 goes to 18. That's right? Yes. Those are being proposed in Midtown South, as I mentioned before, but they're on the books now, and they could be mapped elsewhere. We also created a couple new medium density districts, R6D and R62. These are both 3 FAR districts. They're plugging an FAR gap that we've realized that we've had over time. So they're just trying to give a wider spectrum of densities available. Next. We looked at our range of special permits and did a little bit of cleaning of the closet. We realized that many of them were becoming outdated by things we had done. Some things we had made as of right, so we didn't need a special permit for them anymore. In other instances, we tried to consolidate a bunch of different, very bespoke special rules. Like, for example, irregular lots had 3 or 4 different permits for very particular things. We tried to consolidate them and create one general special permit for irregular sites. Next. We mentioned this a little bit earlier, but just to flag again, there's lots of special districts and special areas in the city. We mentioned many changes to the underlying rules, but we also tried to carry these through many special districts of the city. So that's something to be on the lookout for. Always check the special district regulations first. Next. Vesting regulations. So in most instances, CHO is more flexible than the previous regulations, but we still understand that many of you may be so far along in the process that you want to use the old regulations. You don't want to change all the section references. And that's an option that's available to you. We created special vesting rules so that if you file before December 5th, 2024, and DOB approves within 1 year from there, then you can continue under the old regulations. That's something we made available for as of right, and then there's also special rules for those projects that are pursuing BSA applications or CPC applications. So slightly different vesting rules for them, but it's same principle that we wanted to give the option available to use those old regulations and continue with them. Next. Administrative corrections. So we tried our best to get the text correct during the public review process of CHO, but because it was so long, and because much of it was done at a breakneck pace, we made several mistakes. Many of them are just typographic errors or just wrong cross sections, but sometimes it's a little bit more serious, and in these instances we often will pursue an administrative correction. We talk these through with our general counsel at the agency, and when we come across something like that, we actually make a note on our page, and it's signified by the black box that we have made an administrative correction to this section, and it's something to be on the lookout for. We've already done probably 10 of these. We have another, several dozen that we're kind of actively working on. So definitely be on the lookout for these because they are changing little pieces of the text. And then we just brought this slide back up. Yeah, let's start some questions.
Hi. For the conversions, it used to be that you couldn't have commercial on the same floor as residential. But I believe it's now, you're allowed to do it as long as they're separate. So in the deep floor plates that we have for conversion, so the core can be, let's say, commercial, and then surrounding it is residential. Am I correct?
So there is part of one of the other City of Yes changes, City of Yes for Economic Opportunity. We did liberalize some of the location of use regulations, and there are instances where yes, now non-residential use and residential can be at the same floor, subject to different environmental criteria. But if you meet all that, then yeah, you could potentially hypothetically do a commercial uses in the interior and then residential in the periphery. Yeah. Or you could use, some of the quality housing program changes that we've made, broadened citywide. You could imagine those being residential amenity kind of along the core as well.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I just wanted to clarify on the expanded quality housing provisions, if it needs to be a 9+ unit situation, or if you could do for less than that.
I believe the 9+ refers to the rec space requirement. So we've expanded the rec space requirement to all multifamily buildings over 9 units as well. But the allowances for floor area exemption, like for amenity space, that's available for any multifamily building. It's only the rec space requirement that's 9+.
Okay. Hello.
Hi.
With the bulk regulations, a little tall. Thank you. With the bulk regulations that are increasing, have you allocated any, in particular, rules and regulations for green spaces? And if so, are those areas that don't accommodate parking, for instance, as a prerogative not to, would they be given any bonuses to do any green spaces?
That's a great question. So not directly, but there's a few places where we do kind of intersect with that. So first, there's a local law that obviously requires green space on roofs and things of that nature. In terms of at-grade space, one of the ways that you can satisfy your rec space requirement is outdoor space. You could have outdoor recreation space. Another thing, if you're looking for sort of just planting requirements, we do have this sort of longstanding provision in the zoning that any space between your sidewalk and your building wall has to be planted. We sort of standardized that through CHO and made it the same rule for low-density districts and high-density districts. That there was previously a planting requirement in low-density districts, and then quality housing had its own rule that was slightly different. We just said it's a standard rule and they all have to be planted. That's probably a few scattershot different ways we get it, but we don't have any bonuses that directly do that.
Or requirements?
Yeah.
Or just that?
Yeah.
I have a question about ADUs and about the other swimming pools.
Okay.
With ADUs, if we have a one-family house, does the CO we get at the end, if we have an ancillary dwelling unit, become a two-family house? And the same with two families, does it become a three-family, and then does it become a multiple dwelling? Has that been defined or tested yet?
Yeah, come on up. Yeah, yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
fine. The other question I have is you showed something else about swimming pools. Did you liberalize the square footage on swimming pools, or is it still limited to 400 square feet, not needing a permit?
I'm looking at Frank for that. Frank is our swimming pool guy.
There was a special permit to build a swimming pool in a multifamily building. It was crazy. I think what we removed was there were limits on location to lot line, that like you had to, in like at R6 and above, it was like 40 feet from a lot line. And in lower density, I think it was like 5. So I think we just made them all 5. I don't remember a square footage. Okay, that makes sense why I don't know it.
That hasn't changed?
Yeah, that's
Okay, thank you.
I just assumed it was.
Thank you. In terms of the ancillary dwelling units, and going back to the setbacks, I have a condition where the client wants to actually keep the garage and therefore utilize the second floor. No, well, this is for the setbacks. And I have a building that is actually too close to the lot line.
Yeah.
What happens to that additional floor?
Yeah, so we created a rule in the non-complying chapter, Article 5, Chapter 4, to try to address that sort of situation. Also, some medium and high density corollaries of that. But we said basically, if you have a situation where you would have a non-compliance be increased or created through a residential conversion, then you can basically maintain that non-compliance and increase it. So in that instance, you could take the non-complying side yard and add a story to it and
Gotcha.
sort of elongate it, extrude it.
Thank you.
Yep.
My question is about the qualifying residences. In some special districts with low-density zone, inside those special mixed-use districts, you said that in those low-density areas, the qualifying residence amendments also being reflected in those special mixed-use districts. But in some instances, especially in Long Island City, that doesn't reflect. Actually, it's reduced from 2 FAR to 1.65 FAR, and that's for R5, paired with M1-2. And right next to it, there is actually R6A, which is actually reflected. So there's suddenly a bulk and an FAR difference of like double
This is
the
like
amount.
Dutch kills.
Yeah.
Yes.
So it kind of creates, for lots that actually split between two zoning districts,
Yeah.
it creates a very weird situation.
Totally. We proposed to change that. That was a council mod. We proposed to make it a qualifying residential site. The council took that out for Dutch kills specifically. Any other low-density MX district would be a qualifying residential site, but that one specifically was taken out. So we tried. Sorry. Wait, but you're totally right that would be, yep.
Yes, when you're looking at the definitions of inner transit zones, outer transit zones, and beyond the greater transit zones, and you look at those definitions in 1210, can you clarify that a little better? Because when we have our site and we're trying to place it in those various three definitions of those zones, and then therefore it gives us all the deductions and so forth, and how to define the qualifying residential site. It also says something about look at the index of these maps.
Yep.
And you click on them.
Yep.
They're in a white format.
Yep.
And then they have a gray area, and it says transit zone. But some of that white areas are in the transit zones, and they don't match up with what's on Zillow.
That's right.
With when you pick your overlay.
Yep.
So is that going to be straightened out soon?
Ideally, yes. So it's all a work in progress. We kind of, all of that was done sort of the night before the city council voted on it. So the text was written in a very quick manner, and we certainly had no time to make any maps that reflected it correctly. Our first
the colors you
order of
have up
business
there
was,
should be in there.
what's that?
The colored definitions you have there.
Yeah.
Should be in those index maps.
Yeah, ideally. We wanted to first get it on Zola so that you all had access to what the geography should be. Now we're going back to the text, and we're going to work with our general counsel to see how we can refine it to make it more user-friendly, because we know it's super complicated. And we need to keep Appendix I, because it's not just used for parking. It has other applicability, so we need to keep some vestige of it there. But we realize that we definitely need to make the interaction between the definitions and Appendix I work better, or just sidestep it and maybe just go directly to Zola. We need to figure out some solution just to make it better. They're as accurate as we can do right now. To the best of our knowledge, they are the exact text, to the best of our knowledge. Yeah, I mean, so the Appendix I is a legacy appendix. It was created as part of zoning for quality and affordability about 10 years ago, and it reflected a geography where special parking regulations for affordable housing were in place. We borrowed that, but it's not a perfect representation of these new zones. It's like half applicable. In the inner transit zone, it's a portion of that transit zone geography. And the outer transit zone, it's like the rest of that transit zone plus some additional geographies. So it's like it's not perfect for either of them. It's only half right for both of them. So it can't be a standalone. It can't be used as a standalone resource to understand either of those transit zones. So yeah, you are completely correct that we need to work on those definitions and make them more user friendly.
twofold question. One is, if we have a commercial overlay and we want to determine our streetscape, if it's tier A, B, or C, the definition for B, which is streetscape something something, sends us to Appendix I. Is anything that's gray a tier B? What in Appendix I will tell me that it's a tier B? Because
This is a great follow-up question to this, because this is what she's referring to are streetscape regulations that were created as part of City of Yes for economic opportunity. And because these terms did not exist yet, it was referring to the transit zone as it existed at that time. So that is correct in referring to Appendix I, and it will be the old transit zone, basically, plus the Manhattan Core, plus the Long Island City area.
So right now, if something is grayed out, should we assume that's tier B?
Yes, that's correct.
And then the follow-up question to that is, if we have a site that has a commercial overlay in a residential district, is commercial then mandatory because of the streetscape regulations, which then often will kick in parking where otherwise you wouldn't necessarily need
It
parking?
would depend. It would depend on the type. So if you're in Tier B, it depends on whether you're subject to the sort of standard rules or if you're eligible for the alternate rules. If you're eligible for the alternate rules, it's just a wrap. All parking has to be wrapped or screened.
Okay.
But it wouldn't require commercial.
So if you have a commercial overlay, commercial use is not always mandatory.
That's right.
It depends on which.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. Thank you.
Yep.
So this is for a site in intertransit zone, which previously had the parking requirement. So I'm looking at 25-11, which says CO after December 5th has no requirement. So if the site already had the previous requirement, does it still need the discretionary action on the CPC side, or is it just automatically eliminated?
Oh, go ahead.
The building exists.
Building is in construction. No
So
CO.
you don't
No
have a
CO.
C of O.
Okay.
No.
So that is why it's written as you don't have a C of O. Like, if you have the ability, if essentially the idea was, if the parking doesn't exist, right, because it doesn't have a C of O, the building doesn't have a C of O, you don't have to keep it for that rule. So that's why it is written about C of Os.
Okay, so if we were to reduce the parking requirement, do we still need discretionary action? Okay.
No, not in that instance, because it's not required parking for that.
Got it, okay.
Yeah,
Thank
that's a
you.
great question.
Yeah, I have a question with regards to the greater transit zone in terms of select mass transit areas. I noticed on the text it mentions about a few districts. I happen to have a site on R3A in its close proximity to the Belrose station. So Belrose and I believe the next station, Floral Park, are mostly within the Nassau County borderline, and so that quarter-mile sort of radius for those doesn't really apply. I saw Mr. Frank emailed me sort of a map that outlines, but what's the difference between, I guess for those two stations, that quarter mile doesn't even reach the Queens County, as opposed to other stations that can do a half mile distance.
After you had emailed me on the map, there are like one or two blocks that are A, within the boundaries of the city of New York, and B, within a quarter mile of those stations. So they are highlighted on the map on Zola. So depending on where, I don't know where your site is and whether it was an R3A, but if you were in those areas, you would have the outer transit zone parking requirement.
Understood. Thank you. Yes, good afternoon. So I want to follow up with the greater transit zone with my colleague Jorge. Basically, we were looking at the maps, and like he said, there's a provision if you're outside the map that if you're close to subway station or what I think they call platform or a bus stop, that you're allowed to be part of that greater transit zone in order to use a zoning, bulk, and parking reductions. Is that correct?
It's transit stations, so it's not bus.
No, it's not bus.
But it's any of the other rail lines, so like.
So it's just MTA, railroads, and.
Right, LIR, MTA, Metro North, PATH.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, totally.
As a follow-up to a question that was asked about a commercial overlay, so if you're in the outer transit zone, you're in a qualifying lot, and there's a commercial overlay, do you have to put commercial on the first floor, or you do not have to put commercial?
It depends, Chris, I think, answered this well. It depends on the streetscape rules, whether they have, whether you, and also your lot width and things like that. Like, there's a number of rules that, like, come into play. You may have a requirement for it for some small amount, but you often will not.
Often will not.
Yeah. The other thing I would just say, it didn't come up, but, like, keep in mind that one thing I mentioned about the in mixed buildings, the non-residential parking relief. So even if you did have that requirement, you often, depending on your lot size, may not even have a requirement for that space.
Got it. Okay.
Parking requirement.
So this is about affordable units, so I don't know if you'll be able to answer this, but for a, thank you, for an office to residential conversion that's falling under MIH, such as the Midtown South Plan, do they have to comply with the MIH site unit distribution, where you can't really clump more than 2/3 of affordable housing on one story and 65% of the building?
Yeah.
Or is that just for new construction?
We'd have to check that. Yeah, we're not as, yeah.
Yeah, I think, can we put that on our, like, list to get back to you? I just don't, it's a good question.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you.